So we're starting off with Nehru Report. This is the third topic of section number 2 after Khilafat movement. 1928, 1924 was when the Khilafat movement came to an end. And this is how we continue with the important events of history 4 years after Khilafat movement. This report was presented. Okay, so Nehru Report was sort of a report that was presented to the British by the Indian population, Muslims, the Hindus, the Sikhs, all of the Indian communities were together in a conference, and they drew up a report as a result of that. All of the points were summarized in form of a report here, and that report is known as Nehru Report. It was presented to the British. So the points that were suggested in the Nehru Report was, first of all, that a strong center with limited provincial autonomy, relations down since Muslims interested in provincial autonomy. Okay, so this is the point, this first point, that it suggested that India should be governed through a central government. There shouldn't be any provincial autonomy. For example, Muslims had always campaigned for provincial autonomy. Provincial autonomy is that every province must have a separate government, a separate governor, and they should basically be responsible for their own matters. Nehru Report, however, suggested that there should be a central government managing the affairs of all the provinces, and provinces should be answerable to the government instead of their own governors. This point was directly in clash with the Muslim ideology. Muslims were always campaigning for the provincial autonomy here. This is why Muslims felt that the points in Nehru Report were presented without consultation with the Muslims, because Muslims wanted something else, and then the points in Nehru Report demanded something exactly the opposite. So this was where the you could say the clashes started to happen. Number two, Nehru Report said that Hindi should be the official language, the national language. Muslims always wanted Urdu to be the official language. If you remember, during the time of Sir Syed Ahmed Khan, Sir Syed Ahmed Khan really worked for the Urdu language. He also if you remember the Urdu Hindi controversy during the time period of Syed Ahmed Khan, so he always wanted Urdu to be the official language, whereas in the Nehru Report you see how the Hindus were they were dominating and they wanted Hindi to be the official language. This was again a point where the Muslims had a clash because they were again campaigning for a different language. Muslims should be given extra seats in the councils. This was another point in the Nehru Report, that the percentage of seats of the Muslims were decreased. Again, this was against the demands of the Muslims. Muslims wanted provincial autonomy. They wanted Urdu to be the official language, and they wanted more seats in the councils. Now, this is why this Nehru Report was objected. It was rejected by the Muslims, and as a result, Jinnah presented his 14 points, because he wanted to tell the Indian population, to the British, that Muslims will not accept anything now at this point in time that is against their ideology, and they know how to protect their rights. And they and so this 14 points were a set of demands, or you could say a stance of the Muslims, that this is what they wanted, and any future negotiation should be based on these following points. All right. So you don't have to remember the 14 points, you just know why the points were presented, and generally the main idea as to what was demanded. Jinnah demanded provincial autonomy. He wanted Sindh and Bombay to be separated as different separate provinces. He opposed the central government system, Urdu to be the official language. They wanted separate electorates for the Muslims. So all of these were the points that were demanded in form of the 14 points presentation. Why were they produced? Number one, because this was sort of an amendment to Nehru Report. So what happened was Jinnah presented an amendment to the Nehru Report as soon as Nehru Report was presented, and he asked that if Nehru, because Nehru was the chair of Jawaharlal Nehru was the chair of the conferences, and he was the one who presented the Nehru Report. So Jinnah presented a few amendments to Nehru, because I mean he was like, if those amendments were to be made in the Nehru Report, Muslims would gladly accept the Nehru Report, but those amendments were rejected by the Hindus. So Jinnah, as a result, presented the 14 points, and he called it the parting of ways. The parting of ways meant that now Hindus and Muslims will not be on these close terms again, and they have different demands. Their ideologies are different. and their stances are completely different. So this was sort of a complete deadlock. Congress had completely different demands. The Muslim League had completely opposite demands. And yeah, so this is why the 14 points were presented. Guys, I hope this is clear to you. Is there any question so far? Guys, is it clear?
Yes.
Okay. Now, Simon Commission of 1927. So right after the 14 points, this Simon Commission, sorry, I think there's this mistake in the timeline. This Simon Commission had to come before the Nehru Report. Let me tell you guys the exact timeline. This 1927 Simon Commission was the Simon Report and Simon Commission took place before Nehru Report. So 1927 Simon Commission. I'm just telling you guys a timeline. There's this mistake in the notes. Simon Commission, then 1927, 28 Nehru Report, and then 1929, 14 points. All right, this is the timeline. So the Simon Commission was presented before the Nehru Report. All right, so what happened was this commission was sort of a delegation sent by the British to India to discuss the future, the political setup of India. They wanted to negotiate with the Indians, to look for a solution to the problems of the subcontinent, and to basically present a mechanism for the government, a sort of constitution for India. Now, this commission had 7 members, and all of those 7 members were British. Indians rejected Indians, the objection that they had was, okay, if they're deciding about the future of the subcontinent, why is there no Indian a part of this commission? So they didn't welcome the Simon Commission. Sir John Simon was the chair of this commission. And the reasons why Simon Commission, this committee was sent to India was, number one, because there were a lot of conflicts between the Hindus and the Muslims. They wanted to restore the peace between the Congress and Muslim League. They wanted to negotiate with both of these political parties. Number two, in 1919, Montfort reforms. So in 1919, what happened was, during the Montfort reforms, British had promised Indians that right after 10 years after the introduction of Montfort reforms, they will present another set of, you could say, political setup of India. They would basically present another constitution sort of thing. So these are mini constitutions where the British are telling Indians how to govern the country. They're trying to tell them, they're trying to set up a practice as to how the India would be governed. So they promised Indians that after 1919, 10 years after 1990, another set of reforms will be presented. So instead of 10 years, they brought back the date to 7 years. And in 1927, they presented the Simon Commission. So another reason for sending the Simon Commission was that British Conservative Party was losing against the Labour Party, and they wanted more, you could say, concessions for the Indians before, basically, for the time they were in power. So these were the 3 reasons as to why the Simon Commission was presented. It was opposed by the Indians. Indians felt as if there was no, because there was no Indian in the community, so they felt as if they were just being threatened, and British were just trying to dominate over them. This is why they rejected the Simon Commission. Now there are a few questions. Okay. You should be prepared for questions like, why was Simon Commission presented? Why was Simon Commission opposed? Why was the Nehru Report opposed? Why did Jinnah present his 14 points? All of these are the 7-mark questions that are basically there in the past papers. Allahabad Address of 1930. Guys, so Allahabad Address was a sort of a public gathering in Allahabad that took place in 1930, and Allama Iqbal was the he chaired this conference here, and he basically presented this idea of a Pakistan movement to the Indians. He gave the idea to the Muslims that, I mean, according to Allama Iqbal, the solution to the problems of the Muslim subcontinent was a separate country. And This idea was based on the ideology of Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, the two-nation theory. Sir Syed Ahmad Khan had already presented this theory back in 1800s, when he felt as if he at that time, by looking at the differences between the two communities, he felt as if the solution was only in the partition, a separate, you could say, in getting separate homeland. So Nehru Report was anti-Muslim. This was what Sir Syed Allama Iqbal basically told the Muslims, and they knew that what the points of opposition were. He also basically tried to awaken these Muslims through different poetic writings, literature, pieces of Allama Iqbal. And this idea that was presented in 1930 here and during Allahabad address, it was accepted by Jinnah in 1940 in form of Pakistan resolution, when this Pakistan movement officially began. So this idea of Pakistan movement, this concept of a separate homeland, was presented in 1930 in Allahabad address. And then right after 1930, the roundtable conferences started taking place. For 2 years, from 1930 to 1932, there were a total of 3 roundtable conferences that took place in England. So if we look at these 3 roundtable, number one, as to why these roundtable conferences were held, first of all, because Simon Commission was opposed. So Simon Commission, if you remember, the Simon Commission of 1927, that was opposed by the Indians. So British felt as if the Indians are still not ready to accept any negotiation from the side of British. The Indians were not ready to accept any reform that the British were trying to present. So British still had this responsibility of managing the affairs of India. Yeah. So they had to still bring up both of the parties to negotiate together. This was another reason as to why they called the leaders of the Congress, the leaders of the Muslim League to England to participate in these conferences and to look for solutions to the problems of the subcontinent. All right. So yeah, another reason as to why the roundtable conferences were called was that the Congress and the Muslim League were at a deadlock. The demands of Congress in the Nehru Report were pretty clear. The demands of Muslim League in 14 points were pretty clear. And both of the demands of the Congress and the League were exactly opposite. And this was a contradiction here. This was where the deadlock was formed, and British had to somehow resolve this as well. Jinnah had been, Indians in particular, had been rejecting all these previous reforms. If you remember, the Moldamento reforms of 1909 were also rejected. The Montfort reforms of 1919 were rejected. The Simon Commission 1927 was rejected. So all of these reforms were being continuously rejected by the Indians, and British thought that they weren't able to make any progress. And in order to do that, they wanted the Indians to come together on a table and talk about their problems. This is why these roundtable conferences were held. So a total of 3 roundtable conferences. Number one, the first roundtable conference was unsuccessful. The second was also unsuccessful, and the third was also unsuccessful. After these 3 roundtable conferences, British was still not able to bring up the two communities to a solution. And the reasons why the first roundtable conference was unsuccessful was because Congress refused to attend it. And when the leaders of Congress did not attend the conference, obviously, how could they make up a solution to the problems? A very important political party of India was not present. Congress, the Hindus, who were a majority at that time, there was no one to represent the Hindus. This is why they couldn't make any solution. So the objective of the roundtable conference was unsuccessful. Just a second, guys. All right, so now the second roundtable conference. It was also unsuccessful. Why? Because if you remember, we talked about these elections in Britain, the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. So there was an election that was about to take place in UK between the Conservative and the Labour parties. What happened was the Labour Party lost power, and the new government, the Conservative government, was less likely to make any reform. They were not interested to make any reform in India. So this was a reason as to why the conference failed. Secondly, Gandhi was there in the conference. The Muslims were also there, but Gandhi said that he will not accept any minority rights. So Muslims wanted to protect their rights. They wanted to safeguard their interest. So this was another problem. Muslims were not ready to accept this stance of the Hindus. Gandhi, he wanted that Nehru Report should be implemented as the Constitution of India. Jinnah wanted the 14 points to be implemented as the Constitution of India. There was a very strong disagreement at this point, and the second conference was again failed. The third roundtable conference was also unsuccessful. And why was that unsuccessful? Because the Viceroy of India was changed. Lord Irwin was replaced with Lord Wellington, and Lord Wellington was not willing to make any reforms in India. So this was another reason as to why the third conference was failed. Secondly, another reason was that Congress had started this non-cooperation movement again, and because of that non-cooperation movement, British had arrested Gandhi and Nehru. So both of the important leaders of Congress were in jail at that time. They were arrested. So because of that, there was no one to represent Congress. Jinnah was also not there in the conference because he was not invited. So obviously he didn't attend. This was another reason as to why the third roundtable conference was also unsuccessful. British had very poorly or very chaotically managed these three roundtable conferences. How could they not invite the Jinnah, a very important leader of a political party that, I mean, Muslim League was a very important political party in India. Secondly, they were arresting these leaders and they were then demanding them to be there in the roundtable conference as well. The Viceroys weren't interested. The Labour Party, sorry, the Conservative Party in the coalition government of the UK was also not interested to make reforms. I don't know what were they exactly expecting out of these three roundtable conferences. So this was just, you could say, a show of power, maybe a show of strength that, yeah, they were trying to make some reforms, but in reality, they were not.
Huh?
Yeah.
Sir, if like the Nehru, Gandhi, British, Jinnah, they all were not like, I guess from studying here, it gives a point that not every, like nobody was interested in the conference. Like people are going and coming, they're not they're like there was not a proper interest
that
in a conference. So how could they lead to making reforms and making or just giving them proper rights?
You're absolutely right that the leaders were not interested. They had different interests, and an answer to this could be that if you see that the leaders on their own ends were trying to present their demands. The Hindus, they tried to present this Nehru report. Jinnah very positively presented 14 points. But when they saw that the British were not interested, the viceroys were not interested, the British government wasn't even interested, and they were and when there was such a strong disagreement between the two political parties of India, this is where they lost hope. Jinnah went into exile in England. Gandhi was arrested. So this 1930s were this period was of very, you could say it was a very chaotic period for the Indian subcontinent, because the leaders were getting arrested. The leaders had these very strong disagreements at this point in time, and the British were also not interested. So yeah, you're absolutely right. But you know what? This is the time that is going to lead to a very stronger event in history, the formation of Pakistan movement. This is where the two political parties are realizing that they need to look for a solution now, because if they won't, you'll see what's going to happen now. We're going to talk about the Congress rule. We'll see what the elections will bring. So you know what? When you leave the decisions on to when you don't take timely decisions, um, so I mean, that's how you realize on the circumstances or the events to make decisions for you. And this is exactly what's going to happen. The leaders were not interested in making the decisions there. They were just delaying the decisions. They were not looking for sort of solutions to deadlocks. The leaders, by leaders, I mean the British, most importantly. Yeah. So now we'll see when the elections will take place in the subcontinent, we'll see how the decisions are going to be made automatically. We'll see how the course of history will automatically be changed, and how the stances would be even more clearer at this point. In 1937, you'll see what's going to happen. And then in 1940, you'll see a completely different course of history. I hope this makes sense for you.
Yes.
This is very interesting. I mean, you pointed out a very interesting point over here. Yeah, very good. So how successful were the three roundtable conferences? You have to write successes and failures. You can write 5 failures and 2 successes. Guys, if you want to know about the successes, look at this paragraph here. Why were they important for the Muslims of India? These are the successes of the roundtable conferences. 3. Number 1, that British agreed on provincial autonomy, which was a point in the 14 points. Secondly, British agreed to make Sindh and NWFP separate provinces. This is again what the Muslims demanded, and Gandhi took a hard line. He rejected the 14 points. This is where the two parties realized that they had to think of something different. And don't you think that the idea of Pakistan movement developed further from this point? Yeah, when Gandhi rejected the ideas of Muslims, Muslims knew that they had to do something on their own. So these were the 3 important successes of the roundtable conferences. But if you want to go with the first 2 successes, you can attempt this question with 5 failures and 2 successes. I would suggest you guys to write 5 failures first on level 3 and then 2 successes on level 4 for this question. How successful were the 3 roundtable conferences? This is your homework as well. You can note it down. How successful were the 3 roundtable conferences? 2 successes and 5 failures. You're going to start off with the question with a simplistic statement that the roundtable conferences were somewhat successful. Because they mostly failed, the failures were. Then write 5 paragraphs with 5 points for 5 failures. Remember, you need to analyze each point independently. And after the 5 points, you're going to switch on to level 4 to the successes, and then you write 2 successes with proper analysis and then 1 evaluation at the end. This is how you're attempting this question. This is the homework. Please note it down. How successful were the 3 roundtable conferences?
So there would be 5 failures and
2 successes. Yeah. All right. So guys, we're leaving Chaudhry Rahmat Ali for now because we're going to study the biographies at the end. Allama Iqbal, Quaid-e-Azam, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Chaudhry Rahmat Ali. Moving on to the Government of India Act of 1935. So what happened was the British, they presented the successes and the failures of the 3 roundtable conferences as an act, as the Government of India Act. So you see, this Act of 1935 had all the successes and failures of roundtable conferences, and they were presented together. Not the failures, sorry, just the successes, but this act itself had its failures as well. So how successful was the Government of India Act of 1935? You can maybe talk about 4 successes and 3 failures. So the successes were that it represented a parliamentary form of government. The British now said the Indians would be given representation. They could negotiate with the British, and then this was basically a sort of democracy that they introduced in India over here. Then British were planning to leave India at this time, and they wanted to transfer the power to the Indians. I mean, this was sort of an analysis for this point, that the British, it meant as if that when the British were interested to introduce democracy here, it felt as if they might be planning on leaving India. They might be, because this is how they're trying to transfer the power to the Indians. This was just an idea. Nobody knew that what was to come in the years to come. Yeah, diarchy was dropped at and provincial autonomy was given. Diarchy was there at the central level. If you remember, in the Montfort reforms, British introduced a system of diarchy, a few subjects under the direct Indian control and a few subjects under British control. So they dropped diarchy at provincial level, and provincial autonomy was guaranteed. But the diarchy was still there at the central level. All right. Then NWFP was given a separate provincial status. Voting numbers were increased to 25%. Yeah, so 2% voting rights were increased, that more people could now vote. And the failures of the Government of India Act was the diarchy was still there at the central level. Viceroy had all the power. British governors could still intervene in the matters of the provinces, so there was no point of guaranteeing that provincial autonomy if they still had the governors on top of the provincial governors. And voting rights, although they were increased to 25%, but Indians felt that this 25% was still not enough for them. They wanted a greater voting percentage in India. This is how the Government of India Act. These were the successes and failures of the Government of India Act. All right. Any questions, guys? Nahi, is it all clear? Okay, let's move on to the next part. Yeah, this is what I was talking about, the 1937 elections. Acha, we're gonna keep this topic for tomorrow because I want you to start attempting the question, the how successful was the three round conferences. We're gonna continue with the 1937 elections, the Congress rule, the last bit of this topic tomorrow. And yeah, you can. I mean, I'll upload these notes on the group, but I want you to attempt the question without consulting these notes. Did you guys maybe take any notes during the class? Do you guys have any written material?